So Daniela is a senior lecturer in Geospatial Health at SASU, which is small area health statistics, and that's part of Imperial College MRC Centre. She's interested in adaptation mitigation strategies that can help fair and healthy places, and her research is supported by advanced geospatial methods to explore spatial patterns of disease.
Great, thank you very much, John. So this is sort of, I know I'm standing between you and drinks, so I try to be as quick as I can, but I think it's, as you pointed out, a really, really important issue. And I think we are coming at this from two different angles. So the first one is what sort of, as Sean just said, my research interest, which is looking at how pollution, air pollution, other factors of the environment differ by different socio-demographic groups across the country. And we want to understand, as part of this research, as those different policies and how those different air pollution projections change by socioeconomic status across the country going forward in time. But then also, very important to what was said as well, this sort of how do we translate that to the public? How do we talk to people about this? So there was a really, really strong element of public involvement and engagement as part of this project. So I'm going to cover this as well, because we're also going to talk to lots of members of the public about how they feel to make those changes, because I think everyone appreciates that's a lot to ask from people. And so I'm going to show you some of the probably quite surprising findings which we got. So I'm starting off by looking at the research bit we did. And inequalities in air pollution exposure are well established from all over the world, and also in the UK. And by that we mean that people who live in more deprived areas or more deprived communities often experience higher levels of air pollution. And that is a real issue, because those more deprived communities are probably also those who have underlying health conditions, they have multiple health conditions, their lifestyle choices might not be as healthy than other areas. So you have much more unhealthy community being exposed to higher levels of air pollution, which then sort of exaggerates the problem and increases potentially health inequalities. So if we're sort of talking about future policies, it's therefore really important to make sure that the policies that are being implemented are not contributing to even further widening that inequality. So what we are trying to do as part of this project is to quantify the differential impacts of those different policy scenarios on air pollution inequalities across different areas, across different populations in the UK. And we haven't finished our work yet, so there is more to come, but this is sort of showing you a snapshot of what we found so far. And I think it would also be interesting not just to look at air pollution concentrations people are exposed to, but also the health burden, how that differs by socioeconomic status. So what we've done is we classified small areas across the UK. So in this case, we used wards using a deprivation index, in this case, the CASTES index. I'm not going to go into much detail, but basically you can see we sort of colored in the whole of the country into most deprived to least deprived. So green areas are least deprived, and the red areas are the most deprived. And this data is generated from the national census, in this case the 2011 census. We then used the air pollution concentrations, which were generated by Sean and were included in the health impact assessment, and you recognize some of those dates. So we used the 2019 as our baseline, and then the projections for 2030, 2040 going forward. We focus, for the purpose of this presentation, on nitrogen dioxide and fine particulate matter. And we look at the balanced net zero pathway, so that if you look back at David's talk, that was the second graph he showed you. And then we looked we looked at the average air pollution levels by deprivation quintile. So what we mean by that is we chop all areas, so we rank them from most deprived to least deprived and chop them up into sort of fifths. So we have like the 20% most deprived areas versus the 20% least deprived. And so this is the data for 2019 baseline. And if you're not familiar with this type of research, you might be really surprised to see that those differences between the most deprived. So this is number one, which is least deprived, and this is most deprived, and that we can really see this really stark increase in average concentration. So you have a graph for NO2 at the top and for PM2.5 at the bottom. And as you can see, this sort of increase in trend is much stronger for NO2 than it is for PM2.5. And we can see that on average, there are like up to 5 micrograms per cubic meter higher concentrations in the most deprived compared to the least deprived in the UK. And then if we look at how this is going to change going forward, so 2013, 2014, you can see that the overall patterns are still the same, but just the level decreased, reflecting the sort of overall decreases in air pollution concentrations. But it's the most deprived areas, still the ones which are experience the highest exposure. We also looked at it by country, so we separated England, Scotland, Northern Ireland, and Wales. And you can see that this overall trend we saw for the UK is reflected in for England. That makes sense because England is contributing most of the areas. But interestingly, for the other countries, in particular Scotland and Northern Ireland, we see more what's called a U shape. So we have high concentrations in more affluent areas and high concentrations in more deprived areas. And that's most likely because inner city areas which have high pollution levels are often also where more affluent people live, but also where more deprived people live. So sometimes we get that sort of trend. And you can see that in particular Scotland, those inequalities are really stark. So we have up to 7 or 8 micrograms per cubic meter higher NO2 in the most deprived compared to the least deprived areas. In order to understand a little bit better what is driving those trends, we started to look a little bit deeper at sort of the different demographic groups that are behind those different areas. So this is different study areas. So this is England and Wales only, a different year. So this is 2021 census data now. And what we did is we looked at 54 variables that sort of describe the demographics and socioeconomic status of the population, so age, income, occupation, education levels, and so on. If they're renting, if they have a mortgage. And we then classified them into a geodemographic classification, as it's known. And we came up with those sort of 5 broad categories. We have much more granular differentiation, but for this purpose, we use those 5 categories, which are sort of urban professionals, which you can find in central London. I'm not sure if you can see, there are some small blobs, sort of Oxford, Cambridge, and also in York. We have multicultural urban living, which is more deprived communities characterized by inner urban areas, lots of different ethnic minorities living together, and you can see sort of areas around Birmingham, outer London, and so on. Multi-ethnic professionals, which are scattered across most of the country, again, close to urban areas, and particularly in the southeast. We have affluent, aging, rural. Not sure if that's the best name for this, but it's sort of basically the rural communities, which are, I mean, by aging, we mean not many young people, young professionals living there. And we have hard-pressed areas, mostly in sort of areas around Doncaster, Whitby, Newcastle, and also in South Wales. And if we look at this, so this is a bit busy, and I didn't have time to clean this up, I'm afraid. But I think you can sort of see that those different colors correspond to those different clusters that we had. And in this case, although the urban professionals are quite a wealthy group, they have the highest air pollution exposures. And you can see, so the first bar is always the 2019, and then 2030, 2040 going. And as you see, we pretty much see the similar picture, that those inequalities reduce, but the pattern stays the same. So what we see is urban professionals have the highest exposure, followed by the hard-pressed communities. And then we have the other urban communities, such as multicultural urban living, and the, not quite sure, I think the affluent aging rural has the wrong color on this, I'm afraid. So that should be green rather than blue. So in summary, what we found was that the inequalities in air pollution exposure are generally more pronounced for nitrogen dioxide than fine particulate matter, and that has to do particularly with the spatial distribution and variability of NO2. The general patterns that we observe in 2019 sort of persist into the future, but they are reduced. We say different patterns across different countries, and also we looked at different regions, which I haven't shown, so not everywhere is the same. But I think the most important thing is that that any policies going forward should really consider the impact it has on different socioeconomic and different communities, and it's a massive opportunity to potentially reduce air pollution and potentially health inequalities. So that was what we've done on the research side, and now what have we learned from talking to people? So we have, we had like various focus groups. We had various what we call citizen panels across the country, and we sort of asked the questions: what do you think would be the biggest impact on you and your family and your friends' life for the, with regards to those net zero policies? And we particularly used the one that Sean modeled. So that was in relation to the electrification of the roads, the vehicles, the heating, and so on. So we had our first citizen panel in London in June in 2022, and we sort of got the things that we expected. So there was then skeptics about how applicable it is to them, how they can afford it. So there was concerns about cycling and safety and so on. But then there were also lots of people who had really good ideas about, so how do we actually bring this change on? So who should be driving the change? Is it the government who is telling us what to do, or are we supposed to do something and tell the government that we want to change? So there was a lot of this people not being sure what's actually going to happen and who should be in charge of this. And also if there would be any guidelines provided to people of if they should change, heat pumps, cars, for example. Are there any guidelines, regulations? Are there any subsidies, and so on? And then we had another one in Glasgow in November, and that sort of brought some, which I thought really interesting factors that we hadn't really sort of thought of from the London and the other focus groups. And they all came around the weather and the fact that people took a ferry to commute to work. And lots of people highlight the fact that in terms of active transport, there's no street lights and it's really dark in winter, and they didn't feel safe walking around those areas. So I think that was really interesting. Then there was lots of things, I think that Sean already mentioned, that what do you do if you're not a homeowner? How can you make those changes? People were not on the grid, so they used oil, coal, logs. They had their own electricity energy source, so they were asking, what are we supposed to do? And then another thing which was really interesting was that people said they don't really listen to the government. They don't listen to anyone. It's people like Jamie Oliver or Martin Lewis that they have most trust in, and if they say something, they are much more likely to listen to them. And then everyone we talked to told us we have to talk to young people because they would be the one who would live with the consequences. They would be the people who understand most about it and who will be most impacted by this. So we did, and we talked to, I think it was year 12 students at South Bank Academy in Elephant and Castle. And the first thing the young people said is, why are you talking to us? What are we supposed to do? We sort of left us all a bit, well, if you don't do anything and you don't think you should be doing anything, who is left to do something? So we worked with them over the course of, I think, 2.5 years in the end. And they were absolutely amazing. So they really turned from not knowing anything, not really having an interest, into really sort of confident people. They sit on stages now, talk about net zero, climate change. Some of them went on to university to study environmental sciences. So really inspirational. And so what we done is we did those initial workshops where we presented some of the work we are doing, and we really talked to them about what it is that we mean by net zero. Because when we sort of started the first workshops, when we said climate change, they were talking about polar bears and meat and those sorts of things. And then over the course of those 2 years, we sort of, as I said, worked with them. And we did a film. And the film is called, air quotes, is an hour-long film. I'm not going to show you any bits. You can watch them yourself if you want. And it's produced by Louis Brown, which you can see here with the microphone, from East London Cable. And he continued working with those young people from South Bank University Academy in Elephant and Castle. But we also added young people from Helensburgh in Scotland. So that's like inner city London versus rural Scotland. And it's a really, really good and entertaining and great film. But one of the sort of things which I thought was really interesting, that Louis taught the young people how to use camera equipment, how to conduct interviews. So they took them home and talked to their parents and their carers and so on. And some of those things were really interesting. So I think one of the things that really came out, that people don't really know what net zero is. So they sort of think they have an idea, but find it really difficult to define it or think what it is. So I think there is a big sort of question about still, how do we educate people? How do we get the message across? This, you can't really see him very well. This gentleman here was really amazing. He sort of was in a social housing somewhere in Elephant and Castle, and he was really inspirational in the sort of way he saw this. And he was like, of course, we are happy to change it. You just need to tell us what it is that you want us to change. And there were loads and loads of people were really aware that they're not doing it for themselves, but they're really happy to do this for their children. And as he says, that if you want to end the world, keep doing as you do. And if you want to do something, then you have to do it right. The young people also interviewed themselves. And I think I sort of picked out some of the quotes which I found quite interesting. So like this young lady here said that it feels a bit like putting off your homework. You know that you have to do it, and the teacher will be very upset if you don't do it, but you just keep putting it off and keep putting it off until suddenly the night before the homework is due and you start panicking a little bit and rushing. Or this person here at the end of the film sort of asked, after we went through all the policies and all that was being done, she then started wondering if the government is actually going to do something about this. Are they going to put pressure on businesses and companies, or is this just something like always in a way? So that was really interesting. So that's the end of my talk. I just want to thank again all the people we talked with, the members of our focus group, the participants in the citizen panels, and particularly students and teachers from the London South Bank Academy and Hermitage Academy and Helensburgh. They were really stars. Thank you very much.